Okay, I thank that member for their fine speech and call upon the member of government to open the back half of this debate. Hear, hear.
I'll take my PYs verbally, please. Opening opposition makes a pretty compelling case about slavery. But the truth is that the human race is enslaved under a lot of different ways. We're enslaved under fragile and weak bodies that break down, that give us horrible disorders that we are never able to fix, that make us die horrible deaths in hospital. We're enslaved under poverty, where we're not able to help our grandmother as she passes away because we need to work on fields, that we have to send our kids that we love away for adoption because we don't have enough money in order to feed and clothe them. These are the ways that we are enslaved. We think creating doubling technology is a way that we can solve the problems of the world, and it's not going to be used in the petty and stupid ways, frankly, that we think our opening half doesn't have creativity to imagine. I want to do one main thing in this speech, which is just to give the extension about the times where people are not going to use doubling technology, the times where they are, and the reason why that is so important. And I really only have one principal response to the opening opposition, which is that I don't understand why it is unjust that you cannot choose to be born as a clone. Presumably, I cannot choose to be born as a child, but that does not mean that parents everywhere should be unable to give birth because nobody chooses their existence generally. I'm not sure why autonomy is generally the winning factor in this round. Extension. People will nearly never use doubling technology because of innate fears. When it is used, it will obviously be regulated beyond reason. Only when it is necessary for your survival, for your family's survival, for the care of the people you love, will it be used. Accessibility and affordability does not mean that the populace is willing to use the technology. Why is this the case? The prospect of a living, breathing human clone is existentially horrifying to the vast majority of the human population. Much of our media depicts the idea of clones as scientifically dangerous. Physiologically, we have a natural aversion to people who look and act exactly the same as us. That's the reason why the idea of doppelgangers are investigated with such morbid fascination and fear by paranormal hunters, for example. We're afraid of getting strangled in our sleep. And we're obviously going to be concerned about some tenuous biological mechanism in these clones that is supposed to protect us from retaliation against them. So it's pretty clear that not the vast majority of people are using this technology for things like doing your passions or being able to go to work. The second thing, we're afraid of new technology broadly and the dangers it can bring. And that's the reason why we're likely to have really good regulation here. So for example, we've been able to genetically engineer mosquitoes so that we can reduce their ability to spread malaria. But even though this technology is surprisingly effective and affordable, there's immense amounts of opposition to it because the idea of scientifically created mosquitoes is terrifying. And there's always the fear of something going wrong. The last thing here, what are you meant to do with a clone? Presumably, you can't just throw the clone out onto the street because there's laws against abandonment and neglect of a creation that you have legal ownership over because you have legal ownership over their actions. The vast majority of people don't want to be followed around by a creation of themselves that mirrors their movements. And more than that, you have to provide for that person. You have to give them food. You have to house them. You have to shelter them at your personal expense. And here's the catch. Just because a clone does follow your commands doesn't mean they can't express their resentment. We have moral aversions to outright slavery, and mainly because we are averse to seeing the pain and suffering of others. I wouldn't feel happy to force my mother or my baby brother to sit at home doing laundry the whole day, which means that exploring your hobbies is probably not where the debate lies realistically. I would feel really uncomfortable sending myself to war, as opposition points out. So it's really unclear why people are going to be using these clones in these ways. The end outcome is, perhaps for rational or irrational reasons, it's unlikely that these clones are used often. So when are they used? The first, when it could probably mean the decision between life or death. And this is where a lot of your fears just go out of the window. In the few minutes that I've been speaking, hundreds of people around the world have died because they don't have an organ transplant, because they don't have a blood donor, because they don't have somebody that could potentially save their lives. If some family's child has a kidney infection, having a clone that could give them their kidney would save their life. It would give them a few more years. And it wouldn't really harm the clone, who is probably able to live a good existence regardless, who is probably able to be treated as a normal child by the family who cares about somebody and something that looks like a child and looks like their child. If a child is born with a rare blood type, being able to clone them means that there will always be someone that can save them with donating their blood to them. And the clone is probably going to be treated well. But the second thing here, we can allow people to care for their families. Exploring your hobbies is probably important, but that's not really where the debate lies. The biggest killer of the world is poverty. It's people who are unable to get enough money to feed their families, or have no hands to harvest crops, or who are unable to move themselves and their families across a war-ridden country in order to find a better life. A clone is an extra person and an extra hand, another person that can go work for your family if you clone yourself, so you don't have to do things like give your children away for adoption or go into really horrible services in order to get money for yourself, which is what happens to thousands of families across the world. You don't have to watch the people in your family die because there's no one able to take care of them in their older years. You can have caretakers that are able to exist for them. The comparative is that we exploit people, and we exploit people under the flaws of humanity. Where we can try and circumvent that, we always should. Incredibly proud to propose.
I thank that member for their fine speech and call upon the member of opposition to continue the back half case rather. Hear.
Okay. Time begins in 3, 2, 1. The problem with these kinds of motions is it all gets too weird and borderline assertive. Can you die? Can you feel things? Do you have a kidney? We don't know any of this stuff. I think in the absence of not knowing a definite answer to any of these questions, you need to default to prioritizing the human owner in this debate, because we know for sure you can die. We know for sure you do have a kidney, and we know for sure you are more sentient than this clone is and have more autonomy. Our extension on closing opposition will be how, regardless how or how often you use this clone and what you use them for, the fact that it exists and it lives with you and you have it means you're going to, in the long term, ruin your relationship with yourself, and you're going to end up really hating yourself. That's kind of bad. So 2 reasons for this then. First, on the more superficial level, I think you just have a lot of your flaws displayed to yourself and other people. For yourself, there are just things that you never notice, but that still exist and could be very annoying, like how you click your pen during debate speeches. Don't do that, but you never notice that by yourself because you're concentrated on the debate speech. Such as like how, I don't know, you like snort at the end of your laugh, which you never notice because you're too busy laughing at whatever's funny. I think what this ends up doing is making people very self-conscious and closed off when they have to see this all the time displayed in their clone. Extend this to other people as well. Little quirks that otherwise will be overlooked by your friends and your classmates because you are a human and you have human interaction are now not overlooked when it's a clone. Stuff like also like little things that you do. I think this will also cause a marginal increase in bullying. So this probably extends off of OO when their only mechanism is just saying like, oh, you could send your clone to like be weird and then that will reflect badly on you as well. But the second part of this extension is I think it goes a lot deeper than this. I think what actually happens is you force humans to confront deeply personal moments in very triggering ways. Because panel, humans aren't the kindest to themselves. In fact, we do really, really terrible things to ourselves that we don't do to other people. We are so harsh on ourselves. We expect ourselves to live up to these imaginary standards, and then we beat ourselves up when we don't. We see ourselves as like the only actor whose rights we really don't have to respect because there's no legal bearing to that. We work ourselves so hard and we get like 2 to 3 hours of sleep, and then we wake up with really big eye bags. And I guess like trigger warning, but we also do a bunch of really bad things like drugs and alcohol, self-harm, starvation in order to cope, and then we hate ourselves afterwards when we wake up. There are also additional things that I think CG points out as well. We'll grow old, we'll get wrinkles, we'll lose teeth, we'll hate our reflection in the mirror every single day. This is the truth of what humans actually live like in the status quo. But the thing is, our only biological protection against all of this stuff is the fact that even though we're stuck with ourselves, we are still the easiest person for ourselves to ignore. We never have to look at our own face if we don't want to. We never have to look at our own body or our own arms. Our cries are the easiest ones to ignore because that's like the way it works. You can like block it out. But the difference now on prop side of the world is you always need to engage with yourself through your clone, because even if you buy CG's analysis that you don't use it that frequently, that you only take it out when you like need a kidney if it has a kidney, the fact that you're responsible for your clone, which they also frame, means that you still have to engage with it. You can't just lock it in a closet when you're not using it. If it's a sentient being, you can't just like, you have to feed it every single day presumably, so you still have to take responsibility over it. So what that means is you still have to engage with your clone in a really bad way. I think this is before I go on, yeah, I'll take the point.
Why can't your clone work?
Huh? I mean, I think your clone can work. I don't know if that changes anything, but like, I think everything I'll say over like and for the rest of my speech, I will also deal with that as well. I think this is still like really bad for personal psyche, because now you do need to look into your own eyes every single day. And if you were just crying the night before to look at your own puppy eyes, you still need to look at like all of the harms that happens. You need to, like your weight loss and your weight gain is super visible when you look at your clone. Even if you take what CG, which I'm presuming what they're implying with the POI, is you can just like send your clone off to work so you don't have to look at it or something. But like you still have to though, because first of all, that's slavery, right? So like you still have to bring it back home to feed it. You're still responsible for it. You need to give it clothes and stuff like that. But second of all though, like even if you're not sending your clone off to work, I still think that like it's now you have to like confront it even more, and it's just really bad for you personally. This is like literally the worst kinds of exposure therapy, and I don't think it'll change people's actions for the better, because there are external, very important incentives that cause people to engage in things like drugs and alcohol in the first place. I think you'll end up hating yourself even more, and the fact that you can't escape it is literally the worst thing that could happen to you. Why would people still choose to use this clone even in this circumstance? I think all of the reasons OG gives about why it could do benefit to you is the reason. People are often short-termists. When you really need to hand in this essay next week, that's the only thing you're concentrated on. You can't predict that in the future it'll cause you this much harm. But second of all, though, I'm going to flip CG as well, because in a world where we always had these clones in the first place, I think it would be very glamorized in media. People already like to glamorize like themselves, their partners, they're like little fluffy chihuahuas. I think it would just be a reasonable extension for that. They also want to glamorize their clone and paint themselves as living a very pretty, like beautiful life. And so it's not actually going to lead people away, especially very important figures like politicians and stuff also have the incentive to use clones for their own personal benefit. At the end of the day, we care about you the most. We're proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their fine speech and call upon the government whip to close out the government bench of this debate. Hear, hear.
Let's begin by really quickly taking Sierra out of this debate. They say when you have a reflection of yourself, this will make people hate themselves. First, many people genuinely are insufferable and don't know it. Maybe this is good for these people when they can reflect on themselves, which makes life better for the people around them. Many people also in the status quo have bad perceptions of themselves, which are rather warped. They have dysphoria, but now that they can adjust their expectations, we can see a realistic depiction of themselves as another person. So in these cases, it can actually be quite positive. But furthermore, I want to point out that if you already hate yourself quite a lot, you probably have incentives to not get this clone because of all of the reasons CO themselves mentioned. So these cases are probably quite minimal in the very first place. But at the very least, we prove that this has mixed results in terms of how this causes you to perceive yourself. And in this case, it's probably outweighed anyways by the fact that these are going to allow, this technology will allow people to not die of organ failure, which probably just is a larger impact in this debate. But that being said, I have like numerous reasons as to why this is principally justified. And this is quite important, right? Because insofar as this is not legitimate, principally, opening government probably cannot buy any of their impacts. So we're going to unlock why this is a justified thing to do and win on just saving lives from like organ failure and all the other benefits Maria gives to you. First, just trivially, I want to observe that principles often exist on a spectrum. So perhaps we might not kill one person to save two people, but we probably would if it would save like 1 billion individuals, right? But we also just value consciousness in people, but we destroy the lives of animals like elephants or monkeys that have consciousness that is comparable to ours. What I'm trying to say here is that principles and the degree to which we instrumentalize beings often exist on a spectrum. It's a weighing of benefits to society or just macro benefits compared to like the concentration of harm to individuals. So insofar as Maria mitigates the harms to the clone, we can probably just win on the massive benefits that are accrued to individuals who can have their lives be saved. And Maria gives us extensive mitigation, right? She tells you that firstly, this technology will often be heavily regulated. People will perceive the clone as a person for all the reasons we hear out of opposition. They have legal rights, very likely, and you cannot inflict catastrophic harm on these individuals. Secondly, she tells you that because of the fact that people are often averse to seeing another individual that is similar to them, you have incentives to not do this in every case, and you realistically use this when it is absolutely necessary to your life, for example, in the case of an organ transplant. And finally, she tells you that the fact that this clone can also act like a human being means that you activate the human empathy that is intrinsic to every individual, which means you have incentives to not abuse it because you don't like the fact that this clone hates being around you and all of these sorts of things. You probably are very uncomfortable with this. So this means the harms to the clones are quite minimal, the benefits to the person are massive, and given that principles oftentimes already are on a spectrum, this is justified. Second, I would suggest that this clone is not another being, but rather it is an extension of yourself. Because what realistically determines someone's identity, right? Identity is an aggregation of personality traits, of your history and your experiences. And in this way, the clone is you because it is your identity. And therefore, in the same way, I defined by my identity, which is an amalgamation of certain experiences, can compel myself or coerce myself to pick up an apple. I can compel myself in another body that has my identity and my experiences to pick up an apple as well. This is morally legitimate and symmetric to the way I compel myself in the status quo. Thirdly, or whatever number I'm on, I want to observe that their actual justification is why this is unjust of coercion is insufficient. Where the fact that everything already is already coercive in the status quo, right? Where it's unjust, if it is unjust, this clone cannot consent to external stimuli, your command. We already cannot consent to external stimuli. Our neurons, like firing in our brains, are dictated by external factors in our lives. I cannot consent to the DNA I was born with, the circumstances in my life that shaped my preferences and the choices I make. This is already relatively, like, unconsensual in the status quo, and therefore probably is not the justification as to why this is unjust in the very first place. Furthermore, I would suggest that alternatives are far more coercive, right? We're in Ops' worst case scenario, where we're in the counterfactual. If this clone does not exist, other people often will be coerced in other ways, right? So if for the people who are on the verge of death, so for example, from a shortage of organs, and they have an organ failure, they often do things like turn to the black market, which it would often gains organs through human trafficking, and those individuals cannot consent either. So in this way, there is marginally more consent because this clone is more proximate to you, so there's more consent involved compared to some random person that was human trafficked on the street that often is the result of having a shortage of organs in the system that we ameliorate on our side of the house. The final thing I want to point out then is that principles often, like, the identity is also multifaceted already. So for example, people with BPD have two personalities that operate separate from one another, but still make decisions that affect the other personality. I am a different person at every slice of time. Like, me right now is fundamentally different from me in the future, but I can still make decisions that affect my identity in the future because of the fact that we have the same starting point of experiences, and we're bound together by our identities and our experiences. And therefore, in this way, the clone similarly has the same starting point of experiences as you as well. And even if these are disparate identities, identity already is multifaceted, and we already give people control over our multifaceted identities by virtue of having like the same starting points of experiences. So this is probably quite important. And I think the implication here is that if we understand identity as a multifaceted concept made up of many moving parts, this clone is just a projection of our identity in another physical body. So this proves why it is morally legitimate. We save the lives of individuals. People already cannot consent to the fact that they have to choose between like working or taking care of their family in the status quo, but it's also opened up agency for individuals, which is quite important. On all these bases, we're very proud to propose.
I thank that member for their fine speech and call upon the closing opposition whip to close out the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
The first thing I want to clarify is when we'll use this clone. What we hear from CG is that you'll be very careful because things like technology is scary. Clones are scary. But a whole bunch of things are scary and we get accustomed to them and we do them all the time. IVF is wild. Being able to pick and choose children is quite scary. Abortion is quite scary. Organ transplants, the idea of putting somebody else's lung into my chest cavity is scary. We get accustomed to these things and we do these things when they help us, especially when they're so useful, like CG says themselves. We can use our clone like a maid. We can go to work instead. And look, we're competitive people. Success is zero sum. If I get a competitive advantage and am able to spend more time on work, spend more time on schooling, spend more time cramming for law school, then I have a competitive advantage against other people. So clearly, it seems that other people are going to notice this. They're interviewing for the same jobs, they're balancing the same families and homes. They use it regularly and then we use it frequently, even if it seems a little bad for you. Like lawyers do a lot of coke for a reason. So consultants all sleep 5 hours a night for a reason. Just because things are bad for you does not mean you will just not do it, because we will evaluate the costs and the benefits, and it will always seem that this is something better because it's something that is affordable and is widely available. I don't want to really I just want Gov to deal with this motion as it is. It is a widely available technology. It's not true that we're just going to not use it because there's an expectation. There's no real choice. It's things like social media, right? It's like everybody else uses it, so you have to too, even if it is bad. So you have no real choice, and then you're stuck, and you have to care for this clone. You have to reckon with you and who you are, you and your odd-shaped birthmarks and weird, cringy stutter sometimes that happens when you do debate speeches. You have a negativity bias. You can't get away from yourself. It magnifies things you don't like. The response from CG is that people just not use this cloning technology if they don't like themselves. We can never predict these things because you didn't notice them originally until you have to interrogate all the little things that you do because you're sending your clone off to work as well. You're making it trying to act like you. And every time you get any kind of criticism about this clone, you know that it is about yourself as well. You're unconscious of most of the little noises you have of yourself. But once you see them, then they're going to magnify because you're going to ruminate on them and it's going to be what you think about solely. The point on CG is that we're going to use this only in niche cases and when it's life or death. We use it for organs. That's a pretty niche case. I think it's never proven to be exclusive to. Presumably, there are other things we can do to help people, in particular the poor people that they like to care a lot about. There are probably labor hour regulations. We're probably going to be able to synthesize organs in the lab pretty soon. It's happening already. I think the impacts on all just seem far worse. You're stuck taking care of a being that looks just like you, that you're critical of. You know that there's nothing you can do to choose or to have a clone or to not have a clone. So I think there's no real choice here. No matter what you do, you're going to be coerced into it. And look, even in the best case, where Gov is going to be able to have a world where we use these clones and we get things like organs from them, how do we treat them? And I think this is clearly where we see the abuses, where we see these people and clones as usable and disposable. We lack empathy for them because they're defined as an inorganic other, and they can still feel these kinds of dislikes. I want to talk about OG now. So OG says that you can do cool things because the clone is going to overcome fear. They also overcome themselves and they undercut themselves with their modeling. They say that the clone cannot think, cannot feel, cannot be sentient. It's not a real person. But if this is true, how is this going to experience things to make you overcome your fear? How is it going to care for your children? Presumably need an emotional adult involved. How is it going to go to work and think critically? How is it going to help you with school? How is it going to help you free up time for the economic benefits, they say? So either it is true that the clone is sentient and suffers greatly, it is coerced to do all these things they wanted to do, the menial tasks that CG likes to talk about, the things that are sad and make us feel like slaves to our lives. Instead, we dislocate it and put it onto other people. But look, none of OG or CG's impacts exist here, because even if it is true that we are still enslaved and there's other tasks that we need to do, what's going to happen? You get more and more tasks. We assume that people can just, take care of their children through these clones that are never emotionally connected. We put these tasks onto our clones and we give people more and more and more work, because this is a profit maximizing society. It is a society where your worth is defined on what you produce. And it's not defined on relationships that you have with other people. It's not defined on the experiences that you have yourself. Instead, we say things like, this clone can be both unfeeling and unthinking. You can live experiences through them as a proxy. Instead, you should just go to work instead. It doesn't make any sense. Or perhaps it's another world where you send this clone to work and you try to live vicariously through them. You cannot experience life through a proxy. Stay-at-home mothers that live through their children end up sad and alone in their future lives once the children leave for university, because there's nothing else for them anymore. They have no more career. So no matter what you do, you're stuck in a world where you're expected to do more. You're stuck in a world where you still have to rely on this clone. And if you don't have one, good luck for you. You're kind of screwed now. Differentiation from OO. They do a bunch of principle stuff in messaging and consent. I think we clearly expand more on that. And it's just clear to me how much it is more harmful to impose this damages on people's mental health, to make them look at themselves over and over in their lives and see only their harms. Proud to oppose.
I thank that member for their fine speech and all debaters for a really excellent debate. It was really one of the grand finals ever.